All right, you're good to go, and I'll go to the next page.
Okay. What I'm presenting here is what I will call my Walter Mitty dream of what I think that the user will get out of the demonstration phase of the DIGS project. And talking with Sid and somebody else who's is contemplating helping us here, I think that this is doable within the scope of the work that we've talked about. So I'm going to present what I think might be a best case scenario. As I mentioned, that this really came from the TRB meeting when Dan said, now that I've got it, what do I do with it? And this really addresses some things that we heard from the audience. The idea being that if we can show some benefit and show them that they can do some things that they might not have been able to do before, that this will be the carrot that would convince them that this is something that they should adopt. So we want to start with the premise that we're starting with a series of validated DIGS files. And at least for this demonstration, in my mind, I was thinking that we had multiple projects. That's probably not going to be the case in here. And then what I kind of have described here is what I'll call the workflow for a user experience. So if you go to the next slide, Al. So what I would envision here, and again, this is certainly open to criticism, critique, and recommendations, but I would envision here that a user who wants to either do the demonstration or play with their own data would load the DIGS files into a directory or browse somewhere to temporarily get their file up on the DIGS website. As Paul just indicated, when we do this, we certainly don't want the Geo Institute to be hosting people's data. This is intended to be a demonstration. So we may want to limit this to 10 files or something along that line that won't bog down the system. But we can discuss that. Again, remembering that this is a demonstration phase of this, that we want them to be able to test drive. And then what I thought in this best case scenario was that the user, what might the user want to see? And I thought that there might be 4 specific things that they might want to see. The first one is, okay, I've got this DIGS file, what's in it? So can we query the DIGS file and produce a table, in HTML most likely, that would identify, in my particular case here, I said multiple projects, but if we're going to limit this to just one project for the demonstration, then they would say, here's what's in the file. It's a project that has this many boreholes, this many test pits, and all of the tests that you've done. And just as an example, if you go to the next slide, Alan, we haven't done this yet. We've been focusing on the plotting, but this is a Word document. But this was kind of what I was thinking that might come out of that first query. If I load up a file, that what I see, and maybe we focus on the upper part of this, is a project. The project says, when did you start it? What was the date that you did the work? What borehole number were you at? The date, and I have data in the DIGS file at a depth of 5 feet. And at that depth of 5 feet, we ran a water content test, an Atterberg limit test, and we did an SPT. So the idea that if they could load up a file and then query the file and say, here's everything you have for your project. So this would be kind of goal number 1, is to do this. And we're working on this. We don't have this automated yet, but everything I've heard from this is querying the DIGS file to produce an HTML table is definitely doable, and we'll figure out a way to do it. If somebody knows a really slick way of doing it, we'd be more than happy to test drive it. But this would be kind of one of the outputs that I would envision. Next slide, Alan. The next type of information that they might need, and again, because we have multiple projects here, this one is essentially what we just saw, where you may be able to point at a map if we do this in a KML type of a format, or on that data sheet that you had from the previously, how do you look at the data itself? So again, this project information is what we just went through. The second or the third data point there would be the test information, so that if the user clicked on one of those tests, say the Atterberg limit test, they would produce, again, essentially a recreation in an HTML format of the data. So this would kind of look like a laboratory data sheet in terms of what the project, who did it, everything that's in the DIGS file for that test would appear in a tabular or in a summary format. So they could recreate this effectively on the fly by doing this. How they get to it is they may browse to it. Ideally, if you have something on a map and you identify this location on the map, you click on that and you get it. And the last is the results. And this one we do have something in because these previous steps were tabular summaries. So if you were to look at the test results, and that's ultimately what we're trying to do with the DIGS, is that we would like them to be able to see a graphical summary of that. And we have two demonstrations of where we've done that. If you go to the next page. Next slide, sorry. The first is that, and this goes back to kind of the exercise that Dan and I went through in him developing the schema, fine-tuning the schema. Alan, I took one of Schnabel's standard laboratory forms and populated it with real data. That's what's shown in blue. So we made up some, not really made up some data, but here's some data that we reported, provided this to Dan, and Dan used this kind of laboratory form to develop and fine-tune the schema for particle size distribution or grain size distribution. So the user presumably has this information using the tool that Roger developed. They will get this into a DIGS format. If you go to the next slide, and the next slide is just kind of a placeholder because these data that I presented here actually came from a plot. This came from Professor Sauer's book for the well-graded material. So that's the grain size curve, and this is the type of plot that a user is going to want to see. I point that out here because this is where really the software people, folks like Scott and Roger, they really provide much more assistance into this than we're going to do in our little simple demonstration, because you'll notice that we have the grain size on a log scale on the lower portion of the x-axis, but we actually have the CIV numbers and the USCS classification already annotated on there. These are going to be software nuances and capabilities that aren't built into this. But ultimately, this is what the user is going to want to see. And so what we did is the data that were presented in the previous lab sheet was the well-graded curve. And then if you go to the next slide, Alan, what we did, and we're going to go through how we generated and what we generated from this. And to do this, we used a web application. Since DIGS is a website, we went to something called Data-Driven Documents, D3, DDD, JavaScript. And this is kind of the website where you can get that. Go to the next slide, Alan, and if there's a little narrative in there right underneath that graphic, and it says that this is a JavaScript library, free, for manipulating documents that are based on data. Kind of sounds like DIGS. So they can be presented in HTML, SVG, all different kinds of formats of documents. And what we did and how we generated the plots, I'm going to show on the next 6 slides very quickly, and then show you 2 examples using one of the applications. So the first thing we did was we took a DIGS file, and in fact we took specifically the DIGS file that Dan had provided us that had a borehole, a grain size distribution, and an Atterberg limit test all in one file, all in one DIGS file. So my colleague, Sid Natakuru, in our office here, was a coding, liked to go back to his coding world. So he developed this, and the first thing he did was he took that XML file and he mapped it to Excel. Next slide. When you map it into Excel, you got the structure that's over on the right-hand side. And this structure identifies everything that was in that XML file in a little more friendly environment. But remember that had the boring log, the grain size distribution, and Atterberg limits, and all we want right now is the Atterberg limit. So we're going to screen, if you go to the next slide, we're going to screen and only try and identify the fields that are for the grain size curve. So when we highlight grain size, these are the fields that come in. And next slide. What we're then going to do is we now want to convert this to a CSV file. So we then take that and we go over to the spreadsheet, an open Excel file, and it will, knowing the structure in the XML, it will then create the column headings in accordance with the XML structure. This is all done automatically with that known structure. And then we import the data. So the first thing is to get the headers, and then the next slide, Alan. The next slide that we get are the data itself. So these are the data that were included in the XML file that Dan had created. And it looks just like a spreadsheet now. It's in a CSV format. And what we did after that, and this is where we cheated, because knowing what that CSV structure was, you'll notice that the structure, it had a lot of information that was in the XML file, but we don't need all of that information if we're going to create a simple plot. So we then map the data that we need into the application that we're going to run for that. And for that application, all we need to know is the borehole number or the sample number and the sieve size that we're going to use and the percent finer. That's the only data that we have to distinguish that. And Alan, I lost the screen. I don't know if that was my connection or if everybody else sees the screen still.
No, I've lost the screen as well.
I've lost it as well.
Okay.
Hang on, I screwed it up. Just 1 second here.
Okay.
Should be back.
Yep. So if you go to full screen, there we go. So the first through line 11 is in fact the data for those 3 fields that came from the CSV file. And again, remember that when we loaded in the CSV file, we loaded everything that was in the DIGS file. We only need 3 of those columns to generate a plot. So we mapped that CSV file into these three columns of the borehole, sieve size, and percent finer. Knowing that structure, we cheated and we added 8 more tests just to show what we could do, and I'll show you that in here. And then once we did that mapping of that one test that I just showed you, that started with Alan with Schnabel's laboratory form, by only doing electronic manipulation, and all of those steps could be done automatically, once for the demonstration phase. That this is the plot that we see, and this particular one, this is in that library. It's called Plotly, P-L-O-T-L-Y, and interesting thing is here, you can see that it does look like a grain size curve, percent finer by weight, versus the grain size on the bottom. And you'll notice that there's a little icon in blue at 100% and a grain size in the bottom. That's one of the nice things in Plotly, that you can take your browser, you can take your mouse, you can hover over any of those points, and it will report the X and Y value for that in this particular one. If you went ahead and you had more files in that digs file than you had just that one, you would do exactly the same thing, and now what you're going to get is multiple grain size curves. And all you had to do was identify the digs file where that data were in. In this particular case, we just made up data for borehole 0 through 9. And the way Plotly works here, this particular plot, if you hover, say, over that purple line, I don't have this done in real demonstration here, but if you hover over the purple line, you can click it and then it will go off the screen. But the caption will just then go to a background shading so that you'll know it's there. Any one that you want to look at, it's just a capability of that particular function. And we just chose one. There's any number of graphs on the web through that D3JC JS that we could have used. And so our game plan in terms of moving forward here is that we want to develop similar plots like this for the Atterberg limits and ultimately put them on a plasticity chart, possibly doing a flow line if we think that that's helpful just to demonstrate the capability. But definitely show the data on a plasticity chart, and then also to show an SPT profile, and again, a graphical profile following much the same that we did before. We query, we do the database, we do the digs file, convert it to the spreadsheet, get it into a CSV format, and then we'll find probably a different application just to kind of highlight that. The idea then is, so that's our graphical part. Then we also think it's important to be able to do these tabulated HTML tables, similar to the one that I presented. It was admittedly a Word file. Ideally, it would be nice to be able to convert this exercise into coordinating it with something that Paul has done with the KML, to where if you went on a map and it said you had this project data and you got it in Google Maps, if you clicked on that, could you get the table and could you get a summary of these results? We'll try that. And as I mentioned,
some of these slides we got to kind of keep this moving.
This is it. This is the last slide and the last bullet on the last slide. So this is just one idea, and I'm certainly open to comments, suggestions, etc. But again, the idea was to try and at least explain a vision for what I think that the user may expect and what might get them excited if they could start to see their data using some of these tools.
Okay. I think it's good. It gives them a quick and dirty sample of how these tools can work. I think what we're ultimately looking for is is Scott and Roger and others to get on board and make them all look pretty for us, but this is a good example of what we can be able to do with it. So thanks, appreciate that. Yeah,
So
go.
Alan, the thought